So I decided to do my project on Japanese fashion and the history of Japanese fashion. And one of the main things of Japanese fashion was kimonos, and the history of kimonos dates back to over 1,000 years ago. Originally, they were used by the wealthy, and they would wear many layers, and they would add gold and floral patterns to them to display their wealth, especially in the royal families. What is not commonly known is that both men and women originally wore kimonos. Now we mostly associate it with women fashion, but originally it was a unisex outfit, which is what made it so convenient, was that there was so many different styles and ways to do it that anybody of any class could wear one. So these are just pictures of different types of kimonos, because depending on the social class and whether you're married and the event, they would wear different types. So in the first one, it's a furisoi kimono, and that was usually used for unmarried women, and they would wear it to ceremonies like the tea ceremony. And they would have the long sleeves commonly. They're very known for having very long sleeves that would hang down. And then the second one is a more casual kimono called a kamon. And those were just worn in day-to-day life by any class, really. They were more solid colors. And then the upper right second photo is what married Japanese women would commonly wear. It would usually be a solid color like black and have something like a gold belt on it. And then the one in the top left, that's what men would commonly wear, and they were a bit more simple and had less floral designs and everything. And then the one in the very right is a wedding kozomo, which is very similar to just the very elaborate ones, but usually they're either white or they're a very light color. And then the bottom right one would be a very early on traditional kimono, where they would have lots of layers, and those were the ones that were commonly worn by the royal families. So kimonos really became popular during the Kamakura period of time, which was around the thousands. And it kind of stayed that way really up until the 1600s. It stayed relatively the same. They were like works of art. They'd be passed down from family to family. They would have a lot of layers, like shown in these pictures. Originally, they were worn with almost like a skirt that was called a hakama skirt. And that was originally the only really socially acceptable way to wear one, but over time they eventually stopped wearing that and they would just wear the kimono. So then we jump into the Edo period, which was around the 1600s to the 1800s. So there was a government that took over. It was the Tokugawa government. And they eventually, I believe around the late 1600s, started to forbid the giant, elaborate kimonos that were a display of wealth. And a lot of this was because at the time they followed a very Neo-Confucianism belief system, which was based off of Buddhist ideals. And in Buddhism, a lot of the point when it originated from Hinduism was to get rid of really that wealthy class or the lower class and just make everyone equal. So the government started enforcing this by outlawing and whatnot, and they outlawed certain materials like gold or the tie-dye paint that they used to use. So the kimonos became very simplified during this time, and they tended to be more solid colors. Although there was a method that people used to rebel that just used paste to draw the patterns, and it didn't use any of the forbidden material. And that became popular around the later part of the era. So then we have the Meiji period, which was around the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. And at this point, Japanese fashion started to collide a lot with Western fashion on both ends, but especially since Japan was so isolated up until that point, they definitely got influenced by a lot of the Western fashion. And a lot of this was because of a government trade deal in 1854. Up until then, Japan had no real trade agreements with the West. So this went a lot with sharing the cultures. And so at this point, the kimonos became a bit less widespread as the Western clothing kind of took an influence, but they was still pretty common. A lot of times what they would do is they would wear kimonos with Western clothing like hats or umbrellas, and they kind of combine like a hybrid of looks. And in this first picture, you can kind of see that with the European dress designs combined with the kimono. And in the second picture, she has a Western hat and kind of combined with a traditional kimono look. It was a bit hard to find pictures from these eras, but the few that I was able to find, it was mostly the hats with the long dresses, almost like the late 1800s Edwardian period dresses. So then there's the Showa Japanese era, which is about the time that World War II started. The kimonos that were still worn did become a lot more simplified because it was the beginning of a war period and supplies were limited. Often, women started to wear pants more often. They would learn how to tailor and make pants in order to save resources for war. Men would commonly wear a uniform-looking kind of dress. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but it was pretty much worn by almost all Japanese men during this period by around the end of a war. And this definitely modernized a lot of the fashion. A lot of women started wearing more pants and Western clothing simply because it was more easier to make. So after World War II and in really the late part of the 1900s, we started to share a lot of media again, especially with the internet being invented and television. And magazines were quite common back then. And there was a lot of subcultures that were created from it and trends. A lot of their trends followed our trends, like the rock age, the gothic rock age. They kind of followed it throughout the thing. But they had a magazine named Fruits that was very common back in the 80s and the 90s, and it would inspire a lot of Japanese street fashion. And America also at the time, we were influenced a lot by that. So we would also start doing cosplay. And a lot of the anime culture that comes over here kind of originated back in this time. So with the Japanese subcultures, or really as it's known now as the Hiragaku street fashion, especially in the more urban parts of Tokyo, it's what Japan's widely known for now in America in terms of fashion. We associate Japanese culture with like cosplay and kawaii, which is cute in Japanese, kawaii culture of dressing up in lorita and everything. But that actually, so it was a big thing in the 80s and 90s especially, and that's when that originated, mostly from the magazines at the time, and a lot of popular bands would start dressing like that. So it did become very mainstream. But it was more of a like costume party thing, almost like they would go to conventions and switch into their anime cosplay or switch into their street fashion. Really, it's not really done in day-to-day situations, which I feel is very stereotyped about their fashion. It's more of like a subculture, almost like we have like Gothic subculture in America. It would be more similar to that. They have a lot of etiquette around a lot of these conventions. Like if you go to a cosplay convention in Japan, they usually will wear normal clothing until they get there and then change in because it's considered different and out of the norm to just wear that day to day on the street. And that actually is something that became more common in America. That's definitely something that how Japan influenced our fashion, because we definitely have a big cosplay scene and anime culture over here. So one of these Japanese subcultures was called Ganguo fashion, and it went against traditional Japanese makeup, which was being pretty much as pale as possible. They would use powders to get their skin very almost to an unnatural pale state. And then they would wear very dark makeup, like very dark eye makeup and dark lip makeup. So this was kind of the opposite. They were very tan and they would bleach their hair into blonde or another colorful hair color. And then they would tan as much as they could. So it was kind of the opposite of the normal beauty standards. And this was one of the main street fashions, especially in the early 2000s. Then there's the anime cosplay fashion, which is still around today. And that's something I was particularly interested in because I used to do a lot of anime cosplay. And I always had a fascination with fashion and makeup, so that was always something that was really fun to me. I get the circle lenses and wear wigs. And it was very fun to dress up. And there's still, in Harajuku, Japan, there's a street that my friend who's Japanese was telling me about, and she said on that street it is still very common because it's known for that, and it's kind of a big tourist area, so they still will dress, and it's a big cosplay area. So some of these pictures I used were just normal cosplaying. Sometimes it will be dressing up as a certain character. Sometimes it's just dressing up in a very doll way. The first two are from two animes I actually watched. This person's dressing up as Elle from Death Note, which made me really happy. But this is really, it's like a subculture. It's more of a for fun thing to do. It's not normalized modern Japanese fashion, but it's definitely something that's still done. So these are just some pictures of that area that I was talking about, the Harajuku, Japan, and here's just some pictures of, this is where a lot of the street fashion that was in Japan is still common. It's mostly done in this area. It's a very high tourist area. A lot of people go, especially people that are